236 airlines in total have ever been registered in the UK, be that fully fledged airlines or UK registered subsidiaries to open up flight freedoms. Either way, only 25 remain. Plenty have come and gone, many have come close, but two airlines, perhaps bitter rivals, have been the mainstay for British long-haul operations. I'm Alex, and this is the history of the British Airways and Virgin Atlantic rivalry, coming up on Aircraft Grade. I have a bit of a soft spot for both BA and Virgin. They opened up the world to me and introduced me to the magic of aviation. I'll always remember my first flight, facing towards the two engines under the 747's right wing. I could have done a lot worse, my first flight being with British Airways, that is. They were quintessentially British. They were the typical company with British in their name throughout the late 20th century. They sat alongside British Gas, British Telecom, British Rail, you get the picture, the nationalised public-owned companies that used to keep Britain going. That was until the mass privatisation plan of Mrs Thatcher's Tory party, and a nonsense, completely professional airline. And then there was Virgin Atlantic, set up by eccentric millionaire Richard Branson, who had become fed up with the state of airlines in the early 1980s, noticing a distinct lack of focus on the experience of the passenger. Having gained his riches in the music business, Branson was left bitter and stranded after his flight to the British Virgin Islands was cancelled, and he was left in Puerto Rico. Any rational passenger would just cut their losses and accept their fate, but not Branson. He hired a plane and flew himself there, charging his fellow dishevelled passengers $39 a ticket, and well, from then on, Virgin Atlantic was born. With dirty tricks, controversies, scandals, these airlines have always been fierce rivals. But is aviation better because of it? Well, you have to wait and see, won't you? British Airways can track its roots back to 1919. You see, BA has never just been British Airways, it was formed from other airlines coming together and consolidating their assets and routes. The first consolidation produced British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC, an airline you've probably heard of. BOAC in itself was the result of two mergers merging, where one of the mergers was a merger. It'll make sense in a minute, I promise. On the 31st of March 1924, four British airlines joined together to form Imperial Airways Limited. These airlines were pioneers during the post-war period. Handley Page Transport, established in 1919, alongside Instone Airline, are the two oldest, and the main reason why British Airways could celebrate their centenary in 2019. Anywho, Daimler Airways, established in 1922, and British Marine Air Navigation Co Limited, what a mouthful, created in 1923, were the final two airlines to form Imperial Airlines. Imperial operated routes throughout the empire, including to India, Africa and Canberra in Australia, which is the best city in Australia, objectively. While the establishment of Imperial Airways was in progress and began operating routes, another merger was in the works. During the 1930s, a small number of air transport companies had begun operating in the UK. Hillman's Airways, Spartan Airlines and United Airways Limited, not the same one as the controversial airline operating in the US, had formed Allied British Airways. Allied British Airways then merged with British Continental Airways to form the original British Airways Limited. The government reviewed the operations of British Airways Limited and Imperial Airways and decided to nationalise them into a single airline in November 1939. The result of this was the aforementioned BOAC. After the creation of BOAC, if you were a long-haul passenger flying out of Britain at the time, chances are you were going with BOAC. Pretty much all UK originating long-haul flights were flown by BOAC, except from the ones to South Africa. They were mainly handled by British South American Airways, but fitting with the theme of British airlines merging, BSAA were merged into BOAC in 1949. BOAC were truly a revolutionary airline. They were the world's first to operate jet airliners, having ordered the de Havilland Comet, and they flew an inaugural service to Johannesburg from London. The Comet has an infamous history when it came to safety, and it was plagued with issues, but I digress. I'm not an aviation expert, nor am I an economist, but I think I have a pretty good understanding as to why merging these airlines into one entity was a great idea. First, the bigger the airline, the more economies of scale. For example, with BOAC being one airline, there is only one set of fixed costs, like HQ rent, staffing, etc. So less costs, more flights, means that each flight needs to contribute less to the total cost of running the airline, so the average costs go down. This means more profit and cheaper ticket prices for passengers. Secondly, with BOAC being the only long-haul British airline, there is less competition, which means more consistent and assured growth and better longevity. Anyway, enough of the probably incorrect economics lesson, let's move on. BOAC handled the majority of long-haul flights out of the UK, I'm starting to sound like a broken record now, and while this was happening, another nationalised airline was being created. The British European Airways Corporation, or BEA, took over all continental European and domestic flights out of the UK. British European Airways, Railway Air Services, Isle of Man Air Services and Scottish Airways were merged in 1947 to form the supposed new BEA. They took over the scheduled services of existing UK independent airlines, and the BEA that merged to create the new BEA was part of BOAC, but when it merged with the other airlines it became independent from BOAC. The idea of merging BOAC and BEA was a constant battle throughout the 50s and 60s. Why this came about was pretty clear. The two had failed to agree who would have the air rights to Cyprus. Merging would solve these problems, and this idea never really came of anything, no, and the situation was eventually resolved when BEA would be allowed to serve Ankara in Turkey and BOAC would be allowed complete control of Cyprus. BOAC wasn't completely happy with this deal as BEA controlled Cyprus Airways, so they could still serve these routes, if not directly. The chairman of BOAC, Miles Thomas, favoured a merger as a resolution of the situation, especially considering the importance of serving the regions in the Middle East. Or the big oil regions in the Middle East anyway. Either way, in 1972, the BOAC and BEA managements were combined under the new British Airways board, and the physical operations of them were combined 2 years later on April 1st, 1974. At the time, this was the biggest airline merger in aviation history and had the world's largest route network. British Airways was a mess after the merger. At least in terms of their fleet, they had a mix of aircraft from their predecessors. They consolidated their fleet and ordered new aircraft to modernise. The Lockheed L1011 TriStar was delivered, and BA went against political pressure and refused purchase of the A300, complicating Britain's EU membership. Where have I heard that before? Anyway, they chose the 757 and the 737 and even introduced the revolutionary British Airways shuttle service, which offered no reservation walk-on flights to Edinburgh, Manchester and Belfast from London Heathrow. In 1976, dual designation for British Airways on long-haul routes was banned, and BA and British Caledonian were no longer allowed to compete on routes. But all of this stuff is boring, so let's get to the important points. BA was one of 2 airlines to fly Concorde, that is very well known, but initially wasn't profitable. That was until the employment of Lord King in 1981, someone who'll be instrumental in our little story. He saw that if he could focus the Concorde on business passengers, they could break even with a 40% load factor. Within a year, Concorde was a massive success. Lord King was credited with transforming the airline from a loss maker into a profit machine. It was dubbed the world's most favourite airline and had a completely overhauled route network. But this wasn't the reason Lord King was brought in to the National Skybus Company. He was employed to get British Airways ready for privatisation. One of the main reasons that Margaret Thatcher's government was voted into power was their push for privatisation and her promise to abolish trade unions. But let's not get far into traditional politics, they're boring and are just controversial. BA consolidated its long-haul operations in 1986. The Hawker Siddeley Trident and Boeing 707 were phased out due to the recession and raising fuel costs, and the 737 was used as a replacement. The carrier was officially privatised and offered on the London Stock Exchange in February 1987. The process was generally considered a success and was praised by industry experts. But that was only the start. I apologise, we're already way into this, but we haven't even got to the good bit yet. British Airways then controversially acquired British Caledonian and Dan Air, effectively buying out their competition. The Dan Air acquisition, I think, is really something that is usually overlooked, but quite an important reason for BA's success today. Suddenly, British Airways not only ruled the routes at Heathrow from Terminal 4, but now had dominating presence in another one of London's many airports, Gatwick. This is controversial because usually one of the main advantages of privatisation is the prevention of government-run companies crowding out a market. This is effectively where government spending increasing in the private sector causes the private sector to suffer. Well, that appeared to have happened anyway. They had little to no competition and held the majority of profitable routes hostage, at least until a certain eccentric millionaire became very annoyed. The origin story of Virgin Atlantic is really something quite incredible. Just over 35 years ago, Richard Branson, the founder of the successful Virgin Records, was due to fly from Puerto Rico to the British Virgin Islands with American Airlines. His flight was cancelled, meaning he wasn't going to get to his destination on time, at least with American. I know that in this situation I'd probably just have a little cry, blow the whole situation way out of proportion, and then eventually accept my fate. And I think most people would have a similar reaction, but probably, thankfully, Richard Branson isn't like me. He did something that shows why he's such a great entrepreneur. Branson went to the back of the airport and inquired about chartering a plane. He realised that if he chose to charter a plane to the British Virgin Islands and he filled it up, it would only cost $39 per passenger. So he grabbed a blackboard and wandered up and down the grounded aircraft. His board said Virgin Airlines, one way, $39 to BVI. He filled up his first aircraft and flew to his destination just like that. When they landed, the passenger sitting next to him said, "Sharpen up your service a bit and you could be in the airline business." The next day, he called up Boeing about possibly getting his hands on a second-hand Boeing 747. I tell you this, along with the excruciating detail about BA's origins, because the way in which these two airlines formed couldn't be more different. Ultimately, their product is very similar: fantastic business class travel and high quality and somewhat cost-effective economy products. But while one started in a mass of mergers, politics and controversial acquisitions, the other was started from a spur-of-the-moment charter of an airliner. This sort of sets a precedent for the way BA would think of themselves and Virgin later on. Anyway, Branson managed to lease a second-hand ex-Airlines Argentina's Boeing 747-200 for the newly formed Virgin Atlantic to use. Branson has said in various interviews throughout the year that when Boeing asked who he was with, company-wise, he simply said Virgin, and that he was told later that no one would ever fly on an airline with such a name. On the 22nd of June 1984, maiden Voyager, the new name of the 747-200, flew from Gatwick Airport to Newark in the States. Branson was very self-aware when it came to the hilarity of his airline's name, but he lent into this. In fact, the slapstick airline was streamed on the first flight. Virgin had entered the aviation market with a bang. They used bright red colours and had fun and friendly crews who weren't afraid to be cheeky and over the top. This is, in Virgin's own words, I'd like to add. I think one of the main reasons Virgin was so successful from the onset is that their tickets were easily purchasable in Virgin megastores and they had access to a large budget from Virgin Records. Basically, Branson had the ethos that if his businesses don't succeed in the first year, he will leave the market. Well, the airline was more than profitable, partly thanks to Virgin Records, Atlantic's sister company, having the financial capability to lease a 747 as their first aircraft, but also partly thanks to them launching their services between June and September, the most profitable time of the year for airlines. Virgin Atlantic continued to have consistent and substantial growth, launching their second route in November 1984, only 5 months after their debut to the market, with a leased BAC 111 flying between Gatwick and Maastricht-Aachen in the Netherlands. I probably butchered that name. Are we really surprised? And 1986 saw the addition of another jumbo, facilitating more routes from Gatwick to Miami. More aircraft continued to be added to the fleet, and by 1990 Virgin were operating to far-flung destinations like Tokyo Narita and Kai-Tak, as well as more US destinations like Los Angeles, JFK, Boston and Orlando. Virgin had kind of placed themselves as the second British flag carrier, though the only airline to challenge BA's dominance in long-haul flights to North America, the Caribbean and Asia. They did it in a way that was unheard of. BA were very corporate, if that makes sense. Sticking to their past of being Britain's nationalised carrier, they were very proper. They weren't seen as a fun airline. Virgin, on the other hand, couldn't have been any more different. They were radical in their bid to build brand recognition. When they wanted to advertise their onboard massage service, the slogan, BA doesn't give a shiatsu, was used. Also, when promoting their individual entertainment screens, 9 inches of pure pleasure was used, and Play With Yourself to showcase their revolutionary seatback games. Possibly the climax of this saga was when British Airways first tried to install their newly built London Eye in 1999 and 2000. There were troubles in getting the wheel up into its vertical position, and it was left helpless on its side. So what did Richard Branson do? Well, he flew a Virgin blimp over the site with BA can't get it up plastered on the side. Virgin weren't subtle. I mean, the name says it all really. But it worked. However, as time progressed, Virgin's customers changed. Like all of us, Virgin had to grow up, and it came a time for them to stop making dick jokes. Their business audience was growing exponentially, and nothing was more evidence of this than their arrival in Heathrow. And this is where it all gets a bit nasty. tensions were already high between British Airways and Virgin Atlantic heading into the 1990s. Virgin had truly arrived on the scene and had been capturing a lot of the demand for some of BA's most profitable routes. They had also continually used provocative marketing techniques to undermine British Airways' image. Notably, the wording they ran on the side of their planes throughout the 90s, "No way BA AA," in a move of opposition to the attempted BA American Airlines merger. But I don't think British Airways really cared, to be honest. To them, Virgin was still this joke of an airline with a small fleet and no chance of challenging them. Branson has even said in an interview that BA said he was too young to fly, too old to rock and roll. This arrogance, I think that's a fair judgment of BA's mindset at the time, reared its ugly head in 1991. The London Air Traffic Distribution Rules controlled the distribution of air traffic between London's two airports. It's kind of in the name. The idea was that airlines that operated to Heathrow before April 1st, 1977 were given exclusive rights to Heathrow, while all other airlines were obliged to use Gatwick. This was mainly done to keep Gatwick profitable. You could still operate to Heathrow if you got permission from the owners of Heathrow and Gatwick, BAA and the Secretary of State for Transport. Now, I'm not saying this system was corrupt. I've seen no evidence of this, but part of me thinks this permission was only given if you were British Airways or had substantially large pockets. Regardless of whether or not I'm talking complete waffle, these rules were dropped in 1991. Virgin Atlantic were given access to Heathrow, and to rub salt into British Airways' wounds, Virgin were granted 2 unused BA slots at Tokyo Narita. This boosted the number of weekly flights from 4 to 6, making it easier for them to compete with the legacy operator. This angered BA chairman Lord King, remember him, the man adored for his ability to bring BA up from the ashes. The last straw in this growing hatred for Virgin was the rescue of British citizens during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, whereby Virgin offered its planes. During a meeting at Gatwick Airport, Lord King told his chief executive to do something about Branson. Now known as the Dirty Trick Scandal, British Airways began a ruthless, maybe illegal campaign to crush its British rivals. The biggest being Virgin, but they also focused on Dan Air, which of course they later acquired, and Air Europe. Virgin had a major weakness: their booking system. Babs was owned by British Airways, so British Airways' team, tasked with stopping Branson, could access their ticketing system and passenger records. BA were also said to have called Virgin's baggage handling team, impersonating fellow Virgin Atlantic staff in order to try and gain insider information. This is all extremely dodgy and highly unethical, at least in my opinion, but I don't think I'm alone in feeling that. To make matters worse for Virgin, once BA found out that Virgin's flights were delayed, they would send staff into the airport terminal to try and poach their passengers and get them to switch to flying with British Airways, sometimes offering generous upgrades. If you can call them generous anyway. This passenger poaching got progressively aggressive. BA staff would telephone Virgin passengers, having gained the information through them breaching Babs, and persuade them to fly with British Airways instead, once again offering upgrades. There were even reports of BA staff phoning up Virgin passengers, impersonating Virgin staff, and claiming that their Virgin flight had been cancelled and that they should fly with British Airways instead. All of this was done secretly behind closed doors, and the information would be fed to high-ranking BA staff in brown envelopes. A BA employee involved in this saga reportedly felt guilty and leaked the details of this campaign to Branson himself. As a consequence, Virgin Atlantic complained to the European Commission, in charge of legislation and enforcing EU law, about British Airways. They dubbed this behaviour dirty tricks. Let's take a minute to think. If I was in BA's shoes and the details about my illicit and dodgy business practices were starting to become unearthed, I'd either pull back and stop what I was doing, or just admit the whole thing in hope of some sort of relaxed punishment for admitting the truth. Clearly, I couldn't have been one of British Airways' executives at the time, as they chose neither of these, frankly, cowardly options. Instead, BA took a leaf out of Virgin's book. Not really, but kind of. I've covered Virgin's habit of using controversial advertising campaigns to taint BA's image in the public eye, but these advertisements were mainly harmless and contained no false baseless claims. I think it's fair to say British Airways didn't follow the same policy in this department. In response to Virgin's complaints, BA chose to launch Operation Barbara, which can only be described as a slander campaign to ruin passengers' trust in Virgin Atlantic as a reliable airline. They released a dossier detailing alleged negative aspects of the Virgin airline. This included false narratives about how often Virgin flights were cancelled or delayed, and other false claims. The result of this was probably perfect from British Airways. You see, newspapers have a habit of printing stories without all the facts first. So when BA reported that Virgin had financial troubles and were denied fuel credit by Shell, the tabloids jumped on it. British Airways even went so far as to hire private investigators to search through rubbish bins of Virgin staff and journalists who had spoken to Branson in a bid to exploit as much information as possible. Understandably, Richard Branson wasn't so impressed. It got to the point that this campaign was really negatively impacting Virgin's sales and the business was actually at risk of going bankrupt. Perhaps that was the plan after all. Claim Virgin Atlantic were running out of money, and in the process of doing this, actually making them run out of money through loss of sales. It's kind of genius when you think about it, but it's an evil genius. He wrote to BA demanding that they look into whatever was going on, but as you would expect, Sir Michael Angus, Deputy Chairman, and Sir Colin Marshall, CEO, denied any foul play. I don't really know what Branson expected, to be honest. They weren't just going to surrender all information about everything they were up to. In March 1992, the inevitable happened. Virgin Atlantic sued British Airways for libel at the High Court of England and Wales after Lord King claimed Virgin were just seeking publicity off the back of Operation Barbara. Suing for libel is basically suing for defamation. It's where a party, BA in this case, publish a false statement or multiple false statements that damage another party's, in this case Virgin's, reputation. Interestingly, I don't think Virgin sued regarding the hacking of their Babs accounts, which is a bit odd. The lawsuit left Branson and the Virgin Group in a very difficult position. It's important to remember that at the time Virgin Atlantic was still a fairly young airline who weren't super cash rich. This meant that an expensive lawsuit was incredibly risky. It left Branson with two options. Either risk losing his airline and record business trying to fight with BA with limited finances, or gain some financial security by selling his record company. Branson ultimately decided that selling his record company would be the best decision, despite it being the most difficult decision he's ever made. In hindsight, he believes that they would have just scraped through without the $1 billion cash injection, but as they say, hindsight is 20/20, and the risk was just too great at the time. The case was set to be heard in January 1993, but a month before the trial, British Airways lawyers decided it would be best to settle out of court after discovering the extent to which BA had gone and facing almost certain defeat. Branson and Lord King met up, and the case was settled. BA and Lord King had to release a joint apology for the Dirty Tricks campaign, despite him denying his involvement. British Airways also had to pay Virgin's legal costs of £3 million, as well as an additional $500,000 to Branson and $110,000 to the airline itself. Branson distributed all prize money to his staff under the guise of the BA Christmas bonus, so that was that. Water under the bridge. Virgin Atlantic continued its friendly British Airways bashing throughout the rest of the 1990s. Most notably in 1997, when British Airways controversially announced a new design for the tail fins on their aircraft. Traditionally, British Airways tails have always been draped in a Union flag, and still are to this day, but they chose to change to a more colourful World Images design. BA claimed the reason for this change was because their previous Landor livery carried an air of arrogance and detachment. Personally, I think this is as close as we're ever going to get to BA admitting guilt in the Dirty Trick scandal. It's clear that they felt they did something wrong and they needed to distance themselves from their past behaviour. Either way, it's fair to say it was unpopular, with former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher infamously covering the tail of a Model 747, carrying the design with tissue paper, describing it as an awful thing. Virgin jumped at the opportunity to challenge this design choice by introducing the Union flag on the front of their aircraft and on the wingtips, using the tongue-in-cheek tagline, Britain's flag carrier. Either way, throughout the rest of the decade and the 2000s, Virgin Atlantic and British Airways saw very different forms of growth. BA continued its expansion and became the world's most profitable airline under the world's favourite airline tagline. The first major move was when they purchased a 25% stake in Qantas, a 24% stake in US Air, and wholly acquired Brahman Airways, transforming it into BA Connect. All of this happened in 1993. British Airways, though, had planned to acquire a 44% stake in US Air, but was stopped from doing so following lack of government approval. Whatever the result, though, it was clear a North American presence was crucial for the airline, especially as that was where the majority of Virgin competition came from. 1993 was a significant year in a more internal sense for British Airways as well. Lord King stepped down as chairman, while still adamant about his innocence. Yeah, right, and Colin Marshall, the previous deputy, took his new place. Bob Ayling was then appointed managing director. This wake of new management, as well as positive cash flow, saw the airline modernise their fleet with the 777, 747 and A320. Like all things in life, this success was short-lived. Deregulation in the aviation market and the emergence of no-frills, low-cost carriers Ryanair and EasyJet, among others, put great competition on British Airways' short-haul routes. Clashing with trade unions, rising oil prices and a high value of the pound sterling were all factors as well. Investors became frustrated and BA was seen as less successful than its 1993 peak. This, coupled with the well-designed tail fins fiasco, caused a mess for BA, at least financially. Despite order cancellations and the sale of their successful but highly subsidised Go low-cost carrier, British Airways was still one of the founding members of the One World Global Alliance, alongside Canadian Airlines, Cathay Pacific and Qantas. This streamlined airline connections gave incentives for BA customers to fly with them, even if they didn't serve the destination directly, and offered shared marketing. Overall, a net positive. By 1999, British Airways reported a 50% drop in profits, its worst since it was privatised in the 80s. Concorde operations were cancelled in 2003, and the 747-200s and old 767s were retired in an effort to cut costs. Despite this, BA were insistent on keeping their full service package on their domestic flights, despite low-cost carriers' aggressive pricing. The late 2000s only made matters worse for British Airways. They were forced to sell BA Connect to Fly B due to lack of profitability, and BA were also investigated by the Office of Fair Trading and the United States Department of Justice for price fixing with, interestingly, Virgin Atlantic. Virgin were granted immunity after Virgin staff reported suspected collusion, and BA were handed a heavy fine of $300 million, and they were later fined $101 million from the EU Commission. The opening of their new Terminal 5 at Heathrow was also a disaster, with over 300 flights being cancelled due to a failure of the baggage handling system. Despite a merger with Iberia allowing the two airlines to share routes and schedules, British Airways were absolutely eating money. It got so bad that in 2009, British Airways asked their 30,000 employees to work without pay for a week to up to a month to save money. That's ridiculous. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The newly established International Airlines Group, formed from the Iberia-BA merger, signed an agreement with American Airlines to coordinate on transatlantic routes. This newly formed alliance saved British Airways an estimated £230 million a year in cost savings, plus a further £330 million a year from the Iberia merger. IAG further acquired airlines including BMI from Lufthansa, and BA set up a new London City-based A318 subsidiary. New CEO Alex Cruz also cut the full service model for domestic routes, something that had plagued their ability to compete with their low-cost giants. This was initially unpopular with passengers, but ultimately highly profitable in the long run. In 2016 and 2017, British Airways turned a profit of over £1,345 million, so £1.34 billion, despite making heavy losses only 6 years earlier. I've sort of rushed through the modern day BA because this podcast is getting quite long, but the long and short of it is the old British Airways wasn't profitable in the modern era. No longer do people care as much about the in-flight service, but more about price and your ability to cut ticket prices and offer your passengers as much choice as possible through code share agreements and airline alliances is the way to be successful. Also, British Airways has a fairly diverse business model in the sense that they offer a vast amount of long-haul and domestic services. So if long-haul travel is halted, say due to a pandemic, at least a short-haul business can still bring in some revenue. Ultimately, BA still needs to cut their workforce by 12,000 jobs due to the pandemic, but they are leaving the pandemic a lot better off than Virgin Atlantic, at least in my opinion. Virgin have always believed that their biggest strength was their independence. Much like British Airways as well, they believe that cabin product and customer experience is what wins you the customers, not price. This is consistent with their original mission. They were the first airline to offer entertainment to all passengers, and that was their focus. But the airline world is turbulent, and complete self-funding and a distinct lack of any alliance membership can be very damaging. Clearly Virgin spotted this, as in 1999, they sold a 49% stake in the airline to Singapore Airlines for £600 million. This offered a capital boost to Virgin to allow for greater expansion and made it easier for customers to book long-distance flights with either airline while sharing frequent flyer programs and airport lounges. Branson said at the time, as our route networks do not overlap, we can come together in offering much wider choice of destinations with the best service on the ground, in the air and at very competitive prices. I think this move was essential in Virgin Atlantic's survival, as they hadn't been able to take advantage of the same economies of scale that British Airways and Lufthansa had from their memberships of Oneworld and Star Alliance. But Virgin Atlantic had underperformed, at least according to Singapore Airlines, as they put their stake up for sale in 2008. Also, the recent American Airlines-British Airways tie-up had caused trouble for Virgin. The most profitable routes, transatlantic, would now have even more competition from their tie-up and likely at cheaper prices. Having made a loss of £132 million in 2010, Virgin were forced to call upon Deutsche Bank to commence a strategic review of the airline's options. Etihad were reportedly interested in buying the stake of Singapore, and Willie Walsh, now CEO of IAG, said he would be interested in acquiring the airline, but only for their lucrative Heathrow slots, which would have brought a complete end to the British Airways Virgin Atlantic rivalry. Alas, it was Delta, having approached Goldman Sachs for acquisition advice alongside Air France KLM, who confirmed the purchase of the 49% stake for £224 million. Willie Walsh predicted that Virgin would be dead in 5 years, as he didn't see Delta wanting to operate the Virgin brand, because if they do, what does it say about the Delta brand? I just don't see that guy, Branson, has anything that stands out in terms of what he's achieved in the industry. Harsh words from Willie Walsh, but there was some premise to what he had to say. Virgin had been fluctuating between major loss making and then small profit making constantly, and cash flow wasn't consistent. I think this is partly due to their lack of any form of major alliance membership and their lack of a short-haul network. That's not to say they haven't tried though. When the International Airlines Group purchased British Midland International, a domestic European airline, in 2011, BMI domestic slots at Heathrow were relinquished. Virgin Atlantic purchased these slots in 2012 in a bid to launch domestic services to Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Manchester on the 31st of March 2013. Operated under Virgin Little Red, 12 daily services were operated with 3 to Manchester and Aberdeen and 6 to Edinburgh, using 4 wet-leased Airbus A320s from Aer Lingus. The aim was to raise long-haul passenger numbers through connections from the north to Heathrow, but ultimately the majority of Little Red customers were just using them for domestic flights. This was due to them having to operate out of Terminal 1 and later Terminal 2 at Heathrow, different from the main airline's base at Terminal 3. They had the worst load figures of any airline in aviation at the time, according to the CAA, at just 37.6% passenger seats occupied. Ultimately, BA's dominance over the UK domestic market and the lack of available slots killed Little Red, and it ceased operations in September 2015. I think the airline could have had more success if they'd operated more flights to more destinations. Ultimately, the more places you fly, the more passengers you'll likely get. Also, they chose to operate highly competitive routes. Virgin tried to enter the domestic market again with a joint consortium, Connect Airways, formed with Stobart Aviation and Cyprus Capital, to take over the struggling Flybe. The deal would have seen Flybe and Stobart Air operations combined into Virgin Atlantic to create a new integrated carrier. The investment into Flybe from Connect Airways, £130 million, wasn't enough, and the airline filed for administration and ceased operations in March 2020. This, I think, could have been successful for Virgin, as they would have inherited a vast route network, but COVID brought too many difficulties, and I think competition from low-cost carriers would have ultimately made them struggle. Anywho, Virgin raised more capital in 2015 with the incorporation of Virgin Atlantic International Limited in November 2015. They operated Airbus A330-300 aircraft, taken over the previously operated routes by Virgin Atlantic Limited between Gatwick, Barbados, St. Lucia, Antigua, Grenada and Tobago, operated on behalf of Virgin Atlantic. This makes perfect sense, at least once you understand why they did it. Incorporating the Nouvelle airline allowed the airline to mortgage some of their slots through open investment on the stock exchange. I also think Virgin have struggled in the past because of their fleet size. Now, it sounds counterintuitive for a cash-strapped airline to want to place a large order of aircraft, but I think it would be beneficial in the long run. Now, bear in mind, I'm not a fully fledged aviation journalist, analyst or an economist, and most of my knowledge is from internet research, but I think airlines gain most of their strength in numbers. For example, for airlines, the Airbus A380 has been a very difficult plane to make profitable. But for Emirates, this isn't the case. Why? Well, they have a massive fleet of 120 A380s, whereas most other airlines only have around 15 or so. Emirates' large fleet allow them to reduce average cost due to economies of scale, and so flying the plane is far more profitable. The same can be said for airlines like Ryanair and EasyJet, who have large fleets of the same aircraft. I think the same logic can be applied to the number of routes an airline flies, but for a different reason. British Airways flies nearly 5 times as many routes as Virgin. Because of this, they're accessing more markets and have more global recognition, so they can build brand loyalty much more easily, as they're likely to fly where someone wants to go. So I think if Virgin Atlantic bit the bullet, bought a lot more planes and flew to many more destinations, they could be successful in the long run. In the short run, however, they might struggle. But that is not easy to achieve, and that's only my opinion. And like I said, I don't have any credentials that make me super credible. We come to the modern day. Virgin is operating codeshare agreements with Aero Mexico, Air France, Air New Zealand, Delta, GOL, KLM, MEA, Singapore Airlines and WestJet, diversifying the options for their customers, and they directly operate to 33 passenger destinations, mainly in the US. Their fleet of 37 aircraft, in the grand scheme of things, is very young, with an average fleet age of 7.1 years, and consists mainly of the A350, 787 and some A330s, with their 747s having been retired in 2020. British Airways is a behemoth in comparison, operating codeshare agreements with Aer Lingus, Air Baltic, Alaska, American, Bangkok Airways, Cathay Pacific, China Eastern, China Southern, Finnair, Iberia, JAL, Kenya Airways, LATAM, Logan Air, Malaysia Airlines, Qantas, Qatar, Royal Jordanian, S7, TAG Angola and Vueling. Independently serving over 160 destinations, with 8 domestic and 24 in the US, with a massive fleet of 284 aircraft, with an average age of 13.2 years. Mainly 777s, A320s, 787s, and of course the A380, with some A350s, and like Virgin, the last of their 747s were retired in 2020. Ultimately, BA and Virgin are very different. British Airways has the advantage of being established just before the Second World War and having a long-established route network inherited from their many mergers, serving both long-haul and short-haul destinations. But that's not to say that Virgin haven't challenged them in the past. And although their rivalry has got toxic in the past, generally they compete fairly. Both used to operate 747s as the backbone of their fleets, both dominate the transatlantic network, and both are in the process of using A350s and Dreamliners to overhaul their fleets. They may have had their differences in the past, and of course will continue to have a fierce rivalry in the future, but at present it seems that both BA and Virgin share a single goal: the return to pre-pandemic flight demand. This was evident in their joint celebration of the reopening of the US, something celebrated with a dual takeoff at Heathrow with both of the airlines' A350s. I'm aware I've rushed through the late 90s and 2000s for both airlines. I barely mentioned the effect of 9/11, I've neglected to mention their onboard service, their modern day destinations and their visions going forward. But I've mainly done this for the sake of brevity. This episode is already the longest ever, and I don't want to get too tied up over smaller details. Nonetheless, I hope you've enjoyed it. So that's it, the history of the British Airways Virgin Atlantic rivalry. You've been listening to Aircraft Grade, the aviation podcast. Make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Aircraft Grade. I've been Alex. Goodbye.